So one type of exploration which I will invite you to practice in your self-reflection paper is to look at your past, understand your past. So earlier in the class I suggested that your worldview, your set of filters are built from, like, you can think of them as building a house or a building where you start with a foundation, and that's when you, very early on, when you're an infant, even before you're born, you start to have certain conclusions, very basic conclusions about life, about what is safe, what is unsafe, who can you trust, who do you turn to for help, right? What are some basic needs that you have, and how do they get addressed? So those are the earliest forms of foundation, and as you grow, you keep adding in more and more bricks, more and more aspects to your worldview. And the earlier blocks of your worldviews are more likely to be unconscious, because some of them happen pre-verbally, before you learn language. And they are extremely important. So one way to understand your worldview is to look at, what's my life story? That's what I call an archaeological and historical self-exploration. Now, you don't know what happens. Most of us, our memory of our life starts only around like 3 or 4. And I don't know what your experience is. For me, it's around 3. I have some vague memories of before 3. Some people claim to be remembering earlier than that, 2 or 1 year. Some people, their memory starts more at 4 or 5. I know for me, like, the reason I know 3 was a cutoff point when I moved from Paris. I lived in Paris. We lived in Paris, my family. We moved to Luxembourg. So there was a big change in housing and climate and surroundings, which marks a clear point in my awareness of, like, I remember that period of change, and I remember a little bit what it was before and after, right? But the first 3 years, which are foundational, we have very few memories of them. But we can ask our parents, or we can ask our caretakers. Sometimes there are videos, family videos that were taken, or photos. So that's kind of like doing a journalistic exploration by asking your caretakers and looking at old records of what was happening in your life at that point is part of self-exploration. There are things you might know, like was there anything big that happened in your first few years of life? Anything positive, traumatic, any big change? Who was taking care of you? Who was your caretaker? Was it your mother? Was it your mother and your father? Was it a grandmother? Was it a nanny? Right? All of those things are very important in understanding your exploration. And then later, once you acquire language, it's easier to remember your life. But asking yourself, what were some key moments in my life? Again, who was mainly taking care of me at different ages? How were they taking care of me? How did they respond to me? Was I happy or not happy? If I had some sort of frustration or certain fears, what were they? How did people respond to them? What were some key expectations for me, some key lessons that I was given? How was I socialized by my parents? What was the parenting style of my parents? Were they permissive or were they more restrictive? Did they use physical punishments? Did they yell at me or did they encourage me? How did they express their love to me? Did they express love to me? Did they encourage me? I mean, all of those things are sort of there's all kinds of possible life experiences. We'll have a unique set of life experiences. Then later, who were my major friends? Who were my enemies? What were my teachers like if I went to school? What were some major activities that I engaged in? What was if I engaged in sports or other forms of activities, what was it like? What were the coaches like? What was the culture of those activities? And all the way you can, then later, romantic experiences, best friends and romantic explorations and pursuits, right? Further school events, all the way to, like, for you guys to now being at Cal Poly. Right? Job experiences, you will find that most of us tend to think of ourselves as normal, which means that we tend to think of our life as somewhat the norm. I've read, I think it's like it comes in the thousands now. I think you have to write a self-reflection paper, which is a very important assignment, very exciting, I think. It can be difficult, but I think it can be very rewarding. It's a lot of work for me to read those. I mean, right now we have a small class, 17 students, so it's like easier than when I have 40 students. But I always find it amazing to read those self-reflection papers. So I've read thousands of self-reflection papers at this point, because I've done this assignment for years. And I can tell you that there's no such thing as normal. There's no such thing as abnormal. So we all have a different life. We all tend to have some kind of trauma or drama happening in our lives that we tend to not talk about. Maybe sometimes we feel like we're the only one, or it's a strange, we don't like to talk about it because we want to be normal. But we all have some trauma or some drama in our lives, big or small. Some have major difficulties in life. Others, they tend to be smaller. It's not fair to compare your experience to somebody else, in that your experience is just yours. What is a trauma for you, whether it's smaller than somebody else, is still your trauma. It's your life. So it's important to you. It's important for you to understand it. It's important for you to attend to it. Now, beyond trauma, there's positive stuff as well. You also have wonderful resources that were given to you by your education, by your life story. And those are unique to you, things that make you very specifically well-equipped for certain activities or for certain aspects of life. And sometimes we don't, where that manifests, we tend to be equally blind to our traumas as to our chances, or the chances we've had. And we tend to be impatient with other people who don't have the same facilities that we have, because we take our facilities for granted. So archaeological and historical self-exploration, very useful way to understand your worldview. So in the self-reflection paper, I'll send more information about it. There's some information in the syllabus already. I can send you more ideas about how to write it. It's going to be due pretty fast because we have a 5 weeks session here in the summer. So I think it's July 13th that is due. So you might want to think about it now already. Start writing, start maybe writing it. My advice for how to write a self-reflection paper is, one, this is not an essay. So do not write in a formal tone. Write in the first person. Write it as if you were telling your story to somebody else. So I'm asking people to just start with their life story. Yes?
So would a format be acceptable, like just writing about your life since you were technically what you remember?
Yeah, absolutely. Usually that's what I recommend. So I recommend that the first 3/4 of the paper be your life story, and that you don't omit your emotions and key events that might be difficult to write about. So that's the touchy part. So, I know that a key aspect of difficulty of the paper is that you're asked to write about yourself in such a way that you might feel like you're exposing yourself a little bit. And a few things, I can't alleviate that, but I can help make you feel a little bit more secure. The one principle that I take very seriously is confidentiality. So everything you write is completely confidential. I'm the only one who sees it, and I don't share it with anybody. So the second thing is, I treat those papers like a therapist would treat patients talking about their life or writing about their life. So meaning that I'm very non-judgmental. I'm very empathetic. Even though I have to grade the paper, what I grade is not your life or what you write about yourself. I grade an effort of self-reflection. I have categories that I use to judge that. But I've read a lot of those papers, and I can tell you that I'm not easily shockable, or you can't really, I have a pretty broad exposure to a wide range of worldviews and people, and you can rest assured that I will not judge you, I will not be shocked by you, and I will in fact mostly enjoy reading about your life stories and your struggles. And some of the experiences that we try to not remember are things that cause certain negative emotions like shame or embarrassment or pain or those kind of stuff, which are usually the stuff that's important to write about, so to explore. And what I invite you to do is to, like in the T group, measure the risk you're taking. So the more you allow yourself to go deep into areas of your life that might be difficult to get deep in, the more potential you have for learning, for getting something out of it. But if you do something that makes you feel really exposed and distressed, it might be too much. So sort of like measure how much you're willing to, how deep you want to go. Right? Knowing that for me, like, you can go as deep as you want. I'm very happy to read all of that. And usually the deeper you go, the better the paper is. But think about it as really, for me, like, even though it's an assignment in a class, most of what I do in this class, we have to have grades, but those are just tools for me. Those are just tools for your learning. Of course, I'm happy. When students learn a lot, I'm happy. But you're not doing this for me. The paper is not for me. I think of it as for yourself, really, for your own self-learning. So it's how much you want to get out of it that should direct how you write the paper. The paper is mainly for you to, after you've written it, to reread it and say, that's interesting, I've learned something about myself. While I'm, again, happy to read it and know more about you, I think the key is like for you to think of it as for yourself. And I just happen to be there as a sort of tool at your disposal to help you in your self-reflection. So that's sort of like the attitude I have about the self-reflection paper. So usually I recommend the first 3 quarters, you just write your life story, unedited. Don't think about writing too well. Don't analyze. While you write your first story, don't try to analyze. Just try to write as it comes. Once you've done that, I would say put it aside maybe for a night or a day and come back to it, reread it, and ask yourself, what are a few themes that I see emerging from this story? What are some key aspects of my personality that might be problematic or some difficulties, or maybe some positive things about myself that I didn't realize I had? So anything that strikes you as a pattern in your life that you notice. Maybe you already knew about this pattern, but now you've got a little more clarity on it. You might discover, I tend to really distrust women. I don't trust women. And where does that come from? Because my mother was not very trustworthy. My experience of my mother was that she was not trustworthy growing up. And I might somewhat have known that, but now realize, and is that, that pattern becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, and you can try to ask yourself, maybe I can change that. What would it look like to trust a woman, right? So that would be an example of like a pattern you could notice in your paper, and a potential action that it's asking you to take, an experiment, right? So that's what you devote your last quarter of the paper is the self-reflection, 2 or 3 patterns, 4 maximum, and ask yourself, what did I notice and what could I do to potentially address those issues that I've noticed? Yes?
Oh, and then as far as page requirements, I saw this 15-page maximum. Do you have like a minimum, or do you just want us to?
Yeah, that's always the question, like the same as, see, I mean, I used to put pages before requirements, and what I've noticed is that when I do that, students will have a tendency to write as many pages as I ask instead of how many pages they feel like they need. And the worst thing that could happen is you filling the pages with blah blah just to fill pages. So some people write, succinctly, they can put a lot of information or a lot of stuff in one paragraph. Others, it takes them a page. The better writers are more succinct. But so if you write 15 pages succinctly, it's going to be better than if you write 15 pages. So it really depends. In general, since you asked the question, and I will give you an answer, I find that less than 10 pages tend to be not enough, because those are double-spaced pages. So 10 pages, like 5 single-spaced pages. So papers tend to usually be around, many people write 14, 15 pages. Some people, shorter papers would be like 11, 12 pages. Like less than 10 typically means that you haven't gone very deep. Because you're writing your whole life story and reflecting on it. So does that answer your question? Somewhat? Okay. Journaling, keeping a journal. That's what I've asked you to do about the T groups in this class. Some of you have said they've done it before. Very powerful. Research has shown that among the most successful people out there in the world, successful artists, successful writers, journalists, successful business people, many of those people keep a journal. So while we might think of journaling, keeping a journal as an adolescent activity, it's actually something that is a good habit to have in your life. Because when we go through our life with, like riding a bicycle, like looking down and racing all day, pedaling, that's most of our life experiences. We have so many things to do, so many demands on us in our modern society that we rarely take the time to just stop and take a deep breath and look around and say, where am I? So it's kind of this idea of pacing. We've had this experience yesterday in the T group. We talked about silence and how it's awkward to face silence because we're used to filling every minute with, of being in a classroom with other people with verbal information. And taking a moment to breathe, to have silence, to reflect, to ponder, right? Authorizing yourself to have a rhythm and to realize that maybe it's not counterproductive. It's not that you shouldn't feel guilty about that. That you going to have a walk and reflect can actually recalibrate you in a much more powerful way than if you've just been pedaling and working on a problem to exhaustion. So I really have found that in my life, that I need moments of pondering, of reflection, of pausing. And writing, journaling is one of those moments. You take the time to ask yourself, what was happening today? What was happening this week? Revisiting things that happened this week. When I had this interaction with this person, I felt there was something left unsaid or undone. What was that, How do I complete this? Or I have this particular persistent feeling or thing tugging at me, and what is it? Let me think about it. What am I really feeling right now about this relationship, about this job, about this project that I'm working on? To gain a sort of better control of our lives, a better sense of where we are and where we're going, journaling is very helpful. We've talked about working with another person. Having another person reflect back to us our own filters, our own psychology, can be extremely helpful. So it can take different forms. Professionals, like coaches, life coaches, or business coaches, psychologists, psychoanalysts, psychiatrists, if you have a big psychological issue, they are experts in the psyche, our psychology, our filters. And sometimes they can help us figure out some of the aspects of our psyche that could be unpacked, could be expanded, ways in which we create our own unhappiness, our own problems, right? one of the most common psychological issue in the US, and I believe probably like in Europe, is depression. It's extremely common. Depression is so common that, and you know, we live in a society where we tend to fear the abnormal, fear the psychological issues that many of us experience, but we think we are ashamed of them. You know. So when you're depressed, not only you're depressed, but then you're ashamed of being depressed and you don't want to talk about it. So let's just put it out there. You know, depression is extremely common. It can happen to any of us in this room. It most likely has happened to some of us and will happen to some of us. So you know, it's like one of the things that you can work on is to go see a psychologist, go see a psychiatrist. So you know, we live in an age of medication. You know, I'll put my stance, you know, my belief out there. I think medication can be very useful, but I think it's overdone in the U.S. I think it's vastly overdone. It's a way to make the problem go away by cheaply. You know. And it's also, you know, drug companies have a vested interest in pushing their agenda against other forms which are simply talking about your problems, you know, exploring, you know, raising your awareness about your filters, empowering yourself to understand your issues. Now, again, you know, I do think that with some cases of, for example, deep depression, you know, it can help to have a medication that helps your brain chemistry so that you can get out of bed and start reflecting on your issues. But I think as long as the drug is accompanied by self-reflection, if you just take the drug and don't do the self-reflection, then I think it's like, you know, it becomes a crutch and, you know, it can make the problem worse. So, but, you know, beyond psychoanalysis and coaching, we've had other forms of help that have existed throughout history. In Catholic religion, the confessional is a, you know, people have often compared that to psychoanalysis. You know, you have an interaction with a priest. You know, now there's a judgment aspect to the confessional, which you know makes it very different from the psychoanalytical, you know, relationship where there's no judgment. You know, the idea is that you let go of judgment and you explore freely. But yet, you know, there's still an aspect of like getting help, support by somebody else. You know, I've talked about best friends, confidants, people who you talk to about your issues, you know, who give you perspective, who reflect things back to you. Those are extremely good forms of self-exploration. I did a Jungian psychoanalysis, it's called analysis, for 7 years. So for 7 years while I was doing my PhD at UCLA, my mentor encouraged me to do a psychoanalysis as a way to understand psychology better. His motto, his approach was, if you want to really study psychology, you've got to walk the talk. You've got to do it yourself, you know. Not just pretend to be out there like studying others and yourself like, you know, pretending that you have no issues. And I think that was such a good approach. It was so, you know, such an honest approach, you know. So I have a psychological training. I'm helping others, but I'm not perfect. I have issues. I'm human. You know, all psychologists and psychiatrists are human, and they sometimes get depressed, and you know, they sometimes walk in the same traps that they help their patients with. You know, and pretending that you're perfect and you don't have any issues is like bullshit. You know, sorry to say that. It's so very powerful to actually experience the process yourself. So for 7 years, I did a Jungian psychoanalysis, and it changed my life. It was an amazing experience. And I discovered I had some issues. Nothing I would have called clinical. But I don't know. Who knows? If I hadn't done a psychoanalysis early on in my 20s up to my 30s, I don't know if some of the issues I addressed then might have become later bigger issues, maybe led to some depression or stuff like that. You know, I don't know. So I'm glad I approached them earlier. So I'll talk a little bit more in the rest of the class about psychoanalysis because it has been so impactful to me. And you can practice some of the techniques of psychoanalysis on your own. You don't need to be in psychoanalysis to do it, although it's much harder to do it alone. If you're spiritually inclined, which I have become, I used to not be, I have become spiritually inclined more and more as I get older. I become more and more spiritually inclined, you know. And again, like I want to talk about this and leave the belief, your belief system completely open. I respect all belief systems and not pushing my beliefs on anybody. I'm just sharing them just for clarity, right? So, usually I talk about this at the end of the class, but where do I come from? I'm French. Most French people tend to have Catholic background, so my parents were nominally Catholic, but they didn't believe really. We didn't go to church. My parents were my father was atheist, staunchly against religion. My mother was kind of more agnostic. She didn't know. So I grew up with no clear religious belief system, except I believe in science. But as I aged, I looked for, I was always interested in the meaning of life and where we come from and where we go after we die and all that. And I found that I turned to philosophy first, to psychoanalysis, and later I was very interested in Eastern philosophies and religions. And I still believe that there's a lot of interesting stuff in the practice of meditation and all that. There's different models like reincarnation, heaven, no heaven. I don't know. This what happens after we die. I really don't know. I'm agnostic on this one. But I think there's a lot of powerful things to be gained in practicing some form of spiritual practice that involves mindfulness, like meditation, contemplative prayer, and the like. You will find that, interestingly, in all religious traditions, whether it be Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, other forms of religion, you have a type of practice that involves contemplation. So let me just clarify what's the difference between contemplative prayer and another form of prayer, which is petitionary prayer. Petitionary prayer is when you pray to a God to ask for something. God, please give me that, red sports car that I really like. Make it happen that this girl that I really find attractive, notices me and falls for me. That's petitionary, asking for something. Not very contemplative, not the type of thing that I tend to discount. I tend to think of that as kind of in the realm of what's the term I'm looking for? I can't remember the term. Anyway, I'll get back to it. But there's another form of prayer. Contemplative prayer is when you just still your mind. And so in sort of some forms of Buddhism, you just try to notice what is. We've talked about that. But in Christianity, it would be like, let's try to see what manifests, how God manifests itself. What is the will of God? And let's do what the will of God is, not what I want personally. So petitionary prayer is like, this is what I want, my small self ego. The will of God, that would be Mother Teresa saying the will of God is for, God wants me to help people in Calcutta, and that's my contemplative practice and prayer is to realize what I need to do beyond what my small self wants to do. That's a much more spiritual, I would say, practice of prayer.